When did ancient humans start smoking? It sounds like a modern habit, something tied to cigarettes, warning labels, and city sidewalks. But the truth goes back much further than that. Long before written language, long before farming, long before the first cities ever existed, somewhere beside a fire, a human being inhaled smoke on purpose, and they liked what it did to them. So how far back does this actually go? The answer is stranger than most people expect, because for a long time, scientists thought they knew the timeline. They believed tobacco use began around 3,000 years ago. That estimate came from ancient pipes found in Alabama, pipes that still carried traces of nicotine deep inside their stone walls. For decades, that was the oldest proof anyone had. Then a fireplace in the Utah desert changed everything. Researchers were excavating a site called Wishbone, buried in the mudflats of the Great Salt Lake Desert. It wasn't glamorous, just an old hearth, some scattered bones, a few stone tools. But inside the ashes, a botanist noticed something small. 4 charred seeds, almost invisible. Easy to miss entirely. Those seeds belonged to a wild tobacco plant, and when researchers dated the site, the number was almost unbelievable. 12,300 years old, 9,000 years earlier than anyone had documented before. Suddenly, the story of human smoking wasn't a few thousand years deep. It stretched back to the end of the Ice Age. But here's the strange part. Tobacco doesn't even grow in that region naturally. The nearest wild tobacco plants were likely growing on hillsides more than 13 kilometers away, which means someone had to walk there. Someone had to recognize the plant. Someone had to decide it was worth carrying home. That is not an accident. That is intention. So what were they actually doing with it? The seeds themselves don't burn easily, so tossing them into a fire for fuel makes little sense. And tobacco seeds contain no nicotine at all. The chemical that matters lives inside the leaves and the stems. Which means these hunter-gatherers weren't just gathering a plant. They were handling the exact parts of it that alter the mind. Researchers believe the group may have chewed it, rolled it into a wad, sucked out the intoxicating compounds, then spit the plant fiber into the fire, seeds and all. It's also possible they smoked it directly, letting the smoke rise into the air the same way people still do today. Either way, one thing becomes clear. Humans were seeking out a mind-altering plant before agriculture, before permanent villages, before almost every technology we associate with civilization. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why? Why would a hunter-gatherer, exhausted from tracking game across an Ice Age landscape, go out of their way to find a plant that offered no food value at all? One researcher studying the discovery put it simply. Intoxicants, he said, are a necessity of life. Not a luxury invented later by bored societies, but something wired into how humans have always coped with existence. Think of your own morning coffee. Think of why people still reach for a drink after a hard day. The impulse to alter your own state of mind may be older than we ever imagined. And tobacco wasn't just useful for a private high. Long after the wishbone hearth went cold, tobacco use kept spreading and evolving across the Americas. Thousands of years later, indigenous groups throughout North and South America wove tobacco into something far bigger than personal habit. It became sacred. Interior peoples across parts of North America would smoke before serious decisions, before hunts, before councils, before wars. Entire meetings would open with a shared pipe passed hand to hand, smoke drifting upward as a kind of offering. Some cultures believed the rising smoke carried prayers toward the spirit world. Others used tobacco in healing rituals, treating wounds, easing pain, driving out what they believed were harmful spirits. This wasn't recreational. This was communication with something bigger than the self. By the time complex civilizations rose in Central America, tobacco had become deeply embedded in religious life. Maya priests recorded smoking tobacco during ceremonies, offering it directly to carved images of their gods. Healers pressed it against tooth hatches and snake bites, convinced its smoke had the power to push away sickness itself. But here's what makes this even stranger. The plant that started as a spiritual bridge between humans and their gods would eventually become one of the most consumed substances on the entire planet, around 5,000 years ago. In the Andean regions of what is now Bolivia and northwestern Argentina, distinct species of tobacco were being cultivated on purpose. One strain, milder and more widespread, would one day become the tobacco smoked around the world today. Another, far more potent, was reserved specifically for ritual capable of pushing users into trance, like states during ceremonies. 2 versions of the same plant. One built for spiritual intensity, the other built to spread, and spread it did. When European sailors reached the Americas, they encountered a plant unlike anything in their own world. At first, it was treated as medicine, something close to a miracle cure. Missionaries folded it into their own religious practices. Sailors carried it home across the ocean. Within a few centuries, a plant once reserved for shamans and sacred fires had become a global commodity, traded, taxed, and eventually mass-produced on an industrial scale. The same plant that once opened ceremonies for hunter-gatherers 12,000 years ago now fuels an industry that manufactures hundreds of millions of cigarettes every single day. Which brings us back to that original hearth in the Utah desert. Nobody sitting beside that fire 12,000 years ago could have imagined where this plant was headed. They weren't thinking about global trade routes or chemical addiction or advertising campaigns. They were simply cold, tired, and curious about a plant growing on a distant hillside. Curious enough to walk toward it. Curious enough to bring it home. Curious enough to put it into the fire and breathe in whatever came next. That single decision, repeated by countless humans across thousands of generations, reveals something about who we actually are. We are a species that has never been satisfied with the world exactly as it is. We reach for things that shift our perception. We chase altered states, whether through smoke, through ritual, through music, or through belief. It isn't a modern weakness. It's ancient. It might even be part of what makes us human in the first place. So the next time you see smoke curling upward from anything at all, remember what that gesture actually represents. It isn't new. It isn't recent. It's a habit stretching back to the very edge of the Ice Age, carried forward by hunter-gatherers who had no writing, no cities, and no idea their small act beside a fire would echo for 12,000 years. They just wanted to feel something different. And in a strange way, so do we.